The first thing he heard was not the guns, but the silence. It was the early hours of a cold morning in late September, 1944, in a damp Dutch farmhouse that smelled of peat smoke and wet wool. The building sat in a low hollow between the dikes west of Nijmegen, its roof tiles patched with tar paper, its walls scarred by splinters. Outside, somewhere beyond the mist and hedgerows, German artillery spoke in heavy, distant crashes. Inside, the only sound was the faint crackle of a wireless set that refused to answer. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. Sergeant Daniel Carter of the 82nd Airborne Division lifted the headphones from his ears and stared at the radio as if he could will it back to life. The set, an SCR-300, sat on a wooden crate under a crooked icon of the Virgin Mary. Its aerial wire snaked out through a cracked window, vanishing into the darkness where paratroopers were digging shallow foxholes in ground that oozed water instead of turning. Carter's hands were numb. He flexed his fingers and tried the tuning dial again, moving slowly across the frequencies that had been drilled into him since Fort Benning. Regimental Command Net, Battalion, Artillery Liaison, Air Support. The channels he should have been hearing were dead or buried under a thin hiss, like wind across a microphone. "Anything?" Lieutenant Mark Hayes asked behind him. Carter did not turn. "Only ghosts, sir." Hayes stepped closer, ducking his head under the low rafters. He was 24, West Point graduate, his jump boots still looking newer than the mud around them. Outside, the rest of the company was stringing field telephones and checking ammunition. Inside, an entire regiment's worth of anxiety seemed to press on the two men and the stubborn box of metal and tubes between them. "If we can't raise division, they won't know we're here," Hayes said quietly. "They know we're here," Carter answered. "They just don't know where here is." The drop, the previous night, had not gone to plan. It never did, Carter thought. The lessons of Sicily and Normandy were written in his bones. Strong winds, scattered formations, traces reaching up like fingers. Men landing in orchards, on rooftops, in canals. Training had taught them that dispersion was normal, that small groups would move toward their objectives and knit themselves together by dawn. It had also taught them that the radio was the one thin thread connecting chaos to purpose. This time, the thread had snapped. Hours earlier, they had jumped from C-47 transports, flying low over a patchwork of flooded fields and dark villages. Their mission was simple on paper and lethal in practice. Secure a string of road junctions and dikes behind German lines to keep the corridor to Arnhem open. 2,000 paratroopers from their regiment had scattered across the countryside in the dark, trusting that by first light, the nets of radio and runners would pull them back into a fighting formation. By dawn, Carter's small group had done its part. They had rallied maybe 150 men from 3 different companies, pushed a platoon of German infantry off a crossroads, and dug in. Patrols reported other American pockets to the north and east. Somewhere, much closer than anyone liked, the engines of German armor could be heard moving on the dike roads. What no one could say for sure was whether the rest of the division had landed where it was supposed to, or whether those 2,000 paratroopers, scattered and isolated, were about to be cut off in detail. "Try again," Hayes said. "Division, then artillery. We need those guns." Carter adjusted the tuning coils with deliberate care. The SCR-300 was a good set for what it had been designed to do. Short-range voice communication from foxhole to foxhole, company to battalion, on frequencies assigned and rehearsed. In Sicily, they had jumped with older sets that broke on landing or refused to work under the damp heat. By 1944, the equipment was better, the procedures refined by grim experience. But no radio could talk if the air was already full. "Sir," Carter said, sliding the dial on its arc. "I'm catching something." He lifted the headphones and gestured. Hayes bent low enough that his cap brushed the ceiling. Through the faint static, a clipped voice rose and fell. It was not English. Carter listened, brow furrowing. German. Probably a regimental net. They're close. How close? The signal's strong. Within a few kilometers. He hesitated. Sir, they're talking about columns on the road, armor and paratroopers. Hayes's jaw tightened. The plan, as they understood it, had been brutally clear. British armor from 30 Corps would drive up a single highway from the Belgian border, linking up with the American airborne divisions along the way. The airborne's task was to hold the flanks, the bridges, and the critical junctions until the tanks arrived. The greatest fear was not German counterattack, but delay. If the armoured spearhead was slowed, the airborne units would find themselves isolated, thinly spread, and surrounded. "Can you get any detail?" Hayes asked. Carter knelt, adjusting the fine-tuner to pull the words into focus. He had learned German before the war in a Pennsylvania town where older relatives still cursed in dialect. It had seemed useless until Sicily, when he found himself deciphering orders shouted across vineyards. Now, he translated in fragments. "They've spotted multiple drops, northwest of here. Small groups moving toward the canal line. They think it's a brigade, at most." He paused. "They're wrong. It's more. Has to be." Hayes straightened, pacing the cramped room. "Once, twice. The brigade, near the canal. That's our sister regiment sector." "Yes, sir. And if the Germans think it's only a brigade, they'll commit just enough to contain it. The real hammer will come for us on the road." Carter knew what the lieutenant was not saying. If the Germans shifted their armor south and east to crush what they believed to be the main threat along the corridor, the scattered paratroopers nearer the canal could find themselves outflanked, driven into the marshes, cut off from any chance of reinforcement or withdrawal. 2,000 men, carried in the night across enemy lines, could vanish before Corps' headquarters even realized they were in the wrong place. "Division needs that picture," Hayes said. "They're still working from last night's plan." "With respect, sir," Carter answered slowly, "Division doesn't have this picture. We're the ones eavesdropping on German nets in a Dutch farmhouse." Hayes stopped pacing. His boots creaked on the warped floorboards. "All right, options." The standard procedure was brutally simple. Stick to assigned frequencies, relay up the chain. Do not transmit on anything else unless specifically authorized. In an airborne operation, where German intelligence and signals units prowled the ether, discipline on the airwaves was not a suggestion. It was a matter of survival. German direction-finding trucks, equipped with loop antennas and skilled operators, could home on a careless transmitter within minutes. Carter had been taught that in every signals manual, every briefing. He had also been taught something else, less formal, but no less powerful. The unspoken expectation that paratroopers, more than any other troops, would adapt when the script disintegrated. "Sergeant," Hayes prompted. "We can keep trying the assigned nets and hope someone hears us," Carter said. "Maybe division, maybe artillery, maybe nobody, or, there was steel under the word, or we break the book, sir." Outside, a distant burst of automatic fire ran along the hedgerows like a zipper. Someone shouted in English, then in Dutch. The sound rolled on, swallowed by the steady growl of artillery somewhere beyond the river. "Spell it out," Hayes said. Carter swallowed. Saying it out loud made it more real, more dangerous. "There's a civilian band. Below our assigned frequencies. Local Dutch sets use it. Farmers listening for weather reports, amateur operators who never turn their dials to war. Our intelligence brief said resistance groups sometimes monitor those channels. So, do BBC relay points, and, if they're close enough, Allied signal ships off the coast, relaying to London." "You're proposing," Hayes said carefully, "to transmit on a civilian frequency in the middle of a German counterattack, using a set the size of a suitcase, from a farmhouse the enemy already suspects is occupied." "Yes, sir," and advertise our position to every German direction-finding team within 20 miles. "Yes, sir." Hayes looked at him for a long moment. "Regimental radio discipline manual says—" "I know what it says," Carter cut in, then caught himself, begging the lieutenant's pardon. "I know. No deviation from assigned frequencies without authorization from division signals. I also know we've been trying those nets for 3 hours and getting nothing but static. Meanwhile, German armor is closing a noose around 2,000 of our own behind that canal. If we do nothing, they walk into it blind." Hayes's nostrils flared. "And if we break discipline, key up on a forbidden band, and the Germans home on us, we lose this position, the crossroads, and everyone in it." Carter did not look away. He had jumped into Sicily when the sky was lit by friendly anti-aircraft fire, into Normandy when the flak over the Cotentin had turned night into a flickering false dawn. The risk calculation had never been clean. It was not clean now. "Sir," he said quietly, "if they crush that regiment at the canal, this crossroads won't matter. The whole corridor collapses. 30 Corps stalls. Arnhem dies. We've seen what happens when the armor is late." Hayes shut his eyes briefly, as if steadying himself against the weight of the decision. When he opened them, they were clear. "What exactly would you send?" he asked. "A barebones contact report," Carter replied, forcing his voice to stay level. "Enemy armor columns identified by call signs from their own net. Estimated positions from signal strength and bearing. Confirmation that multiple American airborne groups are concentrated along that canal line, more than the Germans believe. A warning that if 30 Corps continues to push only along the road, they'll leave those units hanging in the wind. Request for artillery adjustment and, if they can manage it, a diversion of armor north to link up." "And you believe someone listening on a civilian band can push that up the chain in time?" "I believe," Carter said slowly, "that resistance operators here have faster ways of talking to London than we do, sir, and I believe London has faster ways of shouting at corps and army than one sergeant in a ditch." For a heartbeat, the only sound was the crackle of the German net leaking from his headphones, the harsh consonants of a language that had become shorthand for threat. "You understand," Hayes said at last, "that if this goes wrong, your name goes into a court-martial file before it goes on any decoration." "Yes, sir." "And you're still recommending it?" Carter thought of the lessons drilled into him at Fort Benning. Maintain radio discipline, protect your position, obey the chain of command. He also thought of other lessons, the unwritten ones. In Sicily, when a captain had taken a scratch platoon 20 miles off its planned route because the sound of guns told him the real fight was elsewhere. In Normandy, when a lieutenant colonel with barely 75 men had charged a German position that should have required a battalion, because waiting for orders would have meant letting the enemy dig in. Every after-action report had used the same dry phrase. "Initiative at small unit level." "Yes, sir," Carter said again. "I am." Hayes exhaled, a white plume in the cold air. "Then this is what we do. You compose your message. Short as you can. No names, no unit IDs beyond what's essential. You hit that frequency once, twice at most. Then you go dark. If we're lucky, the only people paying attention will be the ones we want. And if we're not lucky," Hayes's mouth twitched, "then the Germans come faster and we do what we always do. We hold as long as we can." He put a hand on Carter's shoulder, a brief, solid wait. "This is your call, Sergeant. I'll sign for it. But history, for good or ill, is going to write it under your name." Carter nodded, feeling a knot in his stomach tighten, then settle. He had jumped into enemy territory more times than he could comfortably count. Each time, he had trusted a silent canopy over his head and a slender harness biting into his shoulders. Trusting a thin strand of invisible radio waves felt no less precarious. He reached for the tuning dial and began to turn it, sliding down past the familiar military channels into the red zone every instructor had told him to avoid. The hiss shifted, deepened, then cleared into faint music, a Dutch waltz from a small local station, oblivious to the front lines creeping around it. He kept going, looking for a gap, somewhere that was not occupied by civilian chatter, but could be found by anyone hunting for anomalies. When he stopped, the dial rested on a quiet patch of spectrum, empty, waiting. He pulled a battered notebook from his breast pocket, its pages already crowded with call signs and frequencies. On a blank line, he wrote three things in quick, neat block letters: the German unit designations he had overheard, the approximate bearings he had derived, and a phrase that made his pen hesitate before it moved. 2,000 airborne troops at risk of encirclement along canal line north of corridor. The number was an estimate. It might be a few hundred more or less. What mattered was the scale and the urgency. He tore the page free and handed it to Hayes. The lieutenant read it once, then again, lips moving silently. He made a small correction, changing north of corridor to northeast of main axis, more in line with staff language, then folded the paper and pressed it back into Carter's hand. "Send it," he said. Carter settled the headphones over his ears, adjusted the throat microphone, and felt the familiar click of the transmit switch under his thumb. For a moment, he did nothing. It was one thing to speak on a net you had been authorized to use among call signs you recognized. It was another to step deliberately into forbidden air. He thought absurdly of the jumpmaster in the doorway of a C-47 shouting over the engines as the red light glowed. "Stand up, hook up, check equipment, sound off. Green light, go." The green light now was nothing more than the tiny glow of the set's pilot lamp. No one would push him out this time. He had to jump of his own accord. He squeezed the switch. "This is Allied Airborne Station, emergency transmission," he said, keeping his voice level, his words precise. "Any friendly station monitoring, stand by to receive. Repeat, this is Allied Airborne Station, emergency transmission." Static answered him. He released, waited, then keyed again. "Friendly station. This is Airborne Sergeant west of Nijmegen. Reading enemy armored movements from intercepted German traffic. Multiple Kampfgruppen redeploying toward canal line northwest and northeast of main corridor. German command underestimates Allied strength in that sector. Estimate approximately 2,000 Allied paratroopers concentrated along canal defenses, at risk of encirclement if corridor axis not adjusted." He paused, aware that every syllable might be riding into the ears of both friend and foe. "Request immediate relay to appropriate Allied headquarters," he continued. "Recommend diversion of armored elements to link with airborne units along canal line and adjustment of artillery fire missions against identified German assembly points. This message may be repeated once only. Then this station will go silent." He gave grid references as best as he could determine them, using Dutch village names and canal bends that any local and any staff officer with a map could recognize. Then he signed off with a simple, anonymous tag. "Transmitting station closing. Out." He lifted his thumb from the switch. The hiss of the ether rushed back into his ears, indifferent. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, a different voice cut through the noise. Not German, not English either, but accented Dutch, urgent and controlled. "Allied Airborne Station, we hear you," it said. "Repeat, we hear you. Keep listening. Do not transmit. We will carry your message." The line clicked. The hiss returned. Carter sat very still, the headphones heavy on his head, the set's dull glow reflected in his tired eyes. Outside, the distant rumble of engines had grown louder, closer. German armor was on the move. Whether it would close its fists around the canal line or find something sharper waiting for it would depend now on whether a single forbidden call could outrun steel. Behind him, Hayes let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for minutes. "Well," the lieutenant said quietly, "if that was crazy, Sergeant, it was at least the right kind of crazy." Carter did not answer. His thumb still tingled from the pressure of the switch, as if some part of him had remained keyed up along with the set. Somewhere, he knew, unknown operators were already scribbling his words, translating them into codes and priorities, pushing them into systems that moved far faster than infantry columns along dike roads. The Germans believed they were about to crush a scattered brigade. If the call had done its work, they were about to discover that the sky and the radios belonged to someone else. For the next 3 hours, Nothing seemed to change, and everything did. The Germans still shelled the crossroads, feeling blindly for American positions with high explosive and airburst. Their armor still clanked along the dike roads, engines laboring in low gear. Their infantry still probed the hedgerows in small groups, testing where the paratroopers had dug in. To the men on the ground, there was no obvious sign that a scrap of speech on a forbidden frequency had reached anyone beyond the farmhouse walls. What did change was the pattern of the noise. Carter noticed it first, because listening was his trade. Between the crumps of artillery and the chatter of machine guns, he heard a different rhythm, a deeper pulse under the chaos, distant at first, almost lost under the German guns, then nearer, steadier. Heavy guns, not German field pieces, but larger, slower voices. He adjusted the volume on the SCR 300 and cocked his head, as if the timbre of sound carried meaning as clear as words. "Sir," he called to Hayes, who was crouched at the window watching the lane. "Listen." Hayes came over, frowning. "I do not need a radio to hear we are being shelled, Sergeant." "Not them." Carter pointed with his chin toward the west. "The others." A breath of wind slipped through the broken window, carrying with it the faint concussion of very heavy shells landing far beyond their own perimeter. "Corps artillery," Hayes said slowly. "Maybe army. They are not shooting at us." "No, sir," Carter agreed. "They are shooting at someone on the other side of that canal." He went back to the headphones, not because he expected music now, but because the German nets had become barometers of their enemy's fear. Where earlier there had been clipped, confident reporting, now some of the voices were strained, the pace higher, commands overlapped. Someone shouted to hold a line at all costs. Someone else demanded more ammunition, more fuel, more men. Carter caught a place name and jotted it down. Then another. The grid of Dutch villages and canal bends he had learned from a briefing map began to flicker into life behind his closed eyes, not as symbols on paper, but as a field of noise and steel. "They are diverting," he murmured, more to himself than to Hayes, "pulling one Kampfgruppe back from the corridor to meet something. They are not sure how big." He pushed the headphones back and rubbed his eyes. "If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today." "Sir, whoever caught that call, Dutch, British, American, someone has been busy." Hayes nodded once, curtly. "We will not know the details unless we live to read them in someone's staff college paper. But if those tanks are not coming for us, they are going somewhere else, somewhere important." The somewhere else was a string of low dikes and narrow bridges, where, by all the logic of German planning, a handful of scattered airborne companies should have been easy to push aside. Instead, as the day wore on, reports filtered back by runners and returning patrols that told a different story. The regiment along the canal line had not been swallowed in a single rush. They had dug in along every field and farm, every culvert and crossing, turning the flat, wet landscape into a mesh of kill zones and delaying positions. They had done what American paratroopers did on any ground that would hold a foxhole. They had made it cost the enemy dearly. What the canal line could not have done alone was draw in sufficient support in time. That depended on higher command understanding that this was not a raid, but a fulcrum. By mid-afternoon, Allied fighter bombers began to appear over the battlefield, shark-mouthed thunderbolts and typhoons sweeping in low to strike at German concentrations. Somewhere further west, heavy artillery continued to fall in regular, patterned salvos, not searching blindly, but walking across target areas as if guided by eyes close to the front. Carter did not claim any of this as his work. He knew better than to believe that one voice in a crowded ether could move armor alone. There were pathfinders, Dutch agents, aerial reconnaissance officers, and staff planners, all contributing pieces of the puzzle. What he could not ignore, though, was the timeline. The shift in German dispositions had begun not long after he had broken every rule in his manual. "Sergeant!" someone shouted from outside. He pulled the headphones off and ducked through the low door into the yard. The air smelled of cordite and churned mud. A runner from battalion command stood there, breathing hard, his face streaked with dirt. "Lieutenant Hayes?" the runner asked. "Here," Hayes answered, stepping out from under the eaves. "Sir, message from battalion." The runner unbuttoned a pocket and unfolded a damp paper. "Division reports canal line holding. Armour from Corps being diverted to link up with airborne elements north of corridor. Artillery priority shifting to that sector for the next several hours. Our regiment to maintain current positions and prepare to support advance when it comes through." Hayes scanned the lines, then looked up at Carter. There was no smile in his face. There never was, in front of the men. Not in circumstances like this. But there was an almost imperceptible flicker in his eyes. "Understood," he told the runner. "Any mention of how Division learned the canal line was the main effort?" "No, sir. Just that information came through quickly from multiple sources." The phrase was sterile, the sort of language staff officers use to flatten out the human decisions behind it. To Carter, it sounded oddly like vindication. As the runner pounded back up the muddy lane, Hayes folded the paper carefully and tucked it against his map case. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "do not let that go to your head. Do not speak of it to anyone outside this yard. But between you and me, I will say this. If 2,000 of our people walk out of that canal line alive, you will have helped move the numbers." Carter nodded once, throat tight. For years afterwards, men would argue over exactly how many lives any single decision had saved or cost. Historians would comb through decoded signals, after-action reports, and private diaries, tracing the branching possibilities of those days. In that farmhouse, in that hour, the calculus was simple. If the Germans had continued to treat the canal line as a minor threat, if Corps artillery had kept pounding the wrong tree lines, if armour had stayed chained to a single road, then those scattered airborne pockets would have been ground down one after another. With every mile the Germans regained along the water's edge, more paratroopers would have been shoved into the marshes or driven against the river with nowhere to go. Instead, under the combined weight of guns, fighter-bombers, and the unexpected aggressiveness of enemy units dug into every fold of terrain, the German push began to stall. Reports that had started the morning with confident phrases like "mopping up scattered paratroopers" shifted to heavy resistance along entire sector, and finally, sustained losses, withdrawal to secondary positions, recommended. To the men along the corridor, none of that academic language mattered. What mattered was that, by the second evening, contact was made not with shattered remnants skulking through the reeds, but with organized companies falling back in rough order, bringing their wounded and equipment with them. They were tired. They were marked by smoke and mud. They had lost friends in the ditches and orchards, but they were not the ghostly handful that staff pessimists had penciled into casualty estimates 2 days before. When word reached the crossroads that more than 2,000 men from the canal line had been extracted and folded back into the division, someone in the yard let out a cheer that startled even the Dutch farmers' chickens into flapping confusion. Carter did not cheer. He sat on his ammunition crate beside the wireless set, listening to the reports with his hands folded between his knees. Numbers were steadying. They were something his mind could grasp when images threatened to overwhelm. 2,058 accounted for, sir, the liaison officer on the net was saying. Some isolated sticks still making their way in, but the bulk is through. Hayes, leaning against the cracked plaster wall, caught Carter's eye and lifted 2 fingers in a small, almost private gesture. It could have been a simple acknowledgement that the regiment had survived. It could also have been a signal to a single sergeant that his crazy call had not gone unanswered. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The days that followed were a blur of movement, mud, and exhaustion. The corridor operation did not magically transform into the clean breakthrough planners had dreamed of. Bridges were still blown under the noses of advancing armor. German rearguards still turned villages into killing grounds and crossroads into traps. British tank crews still cursed the narrowness of the dike roads and the constant ambushes. In the north, around Arnhem, British paratroopers still faced the slow, grinding destruction that would later turn the town's name into a synonym for costly failure. Market Garden did not become the miracle stroke that ended the war by Christmas. It remained, as historians would later name it, a bridge too far. Yet, amid the wreckage of the grand design, there were smaller lines on the map that bent in different directions because of what had been done in farmhouses, ditches, and radio shacks. The Canal Line, north of the main road, where 2,000 airborne troops had been written off in some German staff mind, as a thin, expendable screen, became one of those lines. Years later, when the war was over and archives were opened, analysts would tally the comparative casualties. Without the rapid concentration of artillery and the shift of armoured support, estimated Allied losses along that canal were projected at 70 to 80%. With those reinforcements and the stubborn defence on the ground, actual losses had been closer to 20 to 25%. The difference, measured in human terms, was not a percentage, but men, alive, who would otherwise have been dead or captured. In the cold language of reports, one British officer would write that unorthodox and timely signals intelligence, including ad hoc use of non-standard communication channels, contributed materially to the correct weighting of effort in this sector. He did not know, and would never know, that behind that dry phrase lay a 23-year-old sergeant in a Dutch farmhouse, breaking rules and trusting that somewhere beyond the static, someone listening would recognize the urgency in his voice. For Carter himself, the aftermath came in 3 movements. The first was immediate and physical. After nearly 72 hours of tension, little sleep, and constant readiness, his body rebelled. When the shooting around the crossroads quieted for the first time, replaced by the more distant rumble of a front moving away, he found his hands shaking so badly he could hardly hold a mug of weak coffee. He sat on the farmhouse step as dusk fell, the sky over the fields streaked with the last grey light. A Dutch woman, the farmer's wife, came out with a blanket and draped it over his shoulders without a word. He realized distantly that she had lost as much to this war as any soldier. Crops trampled, livestock killed, sons in Labour battalions, or worse. Yet she stood there offering warmth to a stranger who had turned her house into a target. "Dank u," he managed. She nodded once, her face lined and tired. "Jullie gaan verder," she said in slow Dutch. "You go on. We stay." He thought of that for a long time. In every airborne operation he had known, they had gone in like a storm front, loud, violent, transformative. Then, if they lived long enough, they left, pulled out, or marched onward, leaving civilians to reckon with ruined homes and fields. The sense of falling from the sky as a temporary god of war clashed uncomfortably with the sight of this woman quietly sweeping shell fragments from her yard. The second movement came weeks later, when the division was pulled out of the line to refit. They had marched back through towns where children held up fingers in the V sign, through villages where Dutch flags appeared from hiding places under floorboards. In some places, black cloth still hung over doorways, mourning those killed in German reprisals. In a rear area, where tents spread across a muddy field like a temporary city, a division order came down, summoning Carter to headquarters. He arrived in clean but still faded uniform, boots brushed but scarred. The tent smelled of canvas, cigarette smoke, and wet wool. Behind a folding table sat the division's chief signals officer, a colonel with thinning hair and the calm eyes of a man who had seen more than he would ever say. A clerk stood by with a notebook. On the table lay several sheets of paper and, incongruously, a battered civilian wireless set with its back panel removed. "At ease, Sergeant," the colonel said, motioning him forward. "You know why you're here?" "Not exactly, sir." The colonel tapped one of the papers with a finger. "This is a translation of a Dutch resistance report sent to London on the morning after your, unorthodox transmission. It contains details of German armored movements and Allied airborne concentrations that match very closely the content of a message our analysts believe originated from your position. He picked up another sheet. This is a summary from British Special Operations staff commending an unnamed American airborne wireless operator who utilized civilian frequencies with great initiative under enemy pressure. He set both papers down and looked up. And this, he added, patting the civilian set, is the kind of wireless your message bounced through. A Dutch schoolteacher hid it in a barn, ran a wire through the thatch, and risked his life every time he keyed it. You both broke rules for good reasons. Carter swallowed. Sir, I understand I violated radio discipline. If there is to be a reprimand. The colonel held up a hand. We do not generally decorate men and court-martial them on the same day, Sergeant. He slid a third document across the table. It was a citation, typed and formal, with his name in crisp capitals. The words were the familiar stock phrases of wartime honors, conspicuous gallantry, initiative under fire, disregard for personal safety. They felt strangely detached from the memory of sweaty hands on a tuning dial and a throat microphone. Regulations require me to tell you, the colonel went on, that your actions could have brought German direction finding down on your position. You know this as well as I do. Had that happened, we would be conducting this conversation in a hospital tent, if at all. You will remember that fact the next time you are tempted to improvise. Yes, sir. However, the colonel said, and there was the faintest hint of dry humor in his voice. The results speak for themselves. 2,000 and more of your comrades are alive today who might not have been. That matters more than the ink in any manual. He picked up a small box from the table and opened it. Inside, on faded velvet, lay a bronze medal shaped like a star. On behalf of the commanding general, the colonel said, I am authorized to award you the Silver Star for gallantry in action. The clerk stepped forward with a camera, and the moment was frozen on film. A thin, tired sergeant standing stiffly as the colonel pinned the decoration above his heart. Somewhere far in the background of the photograph, blurred but unmistakable, was the outline of the battered civilian wireless set that had formed part of the circuit. Years later, when the medal lay in a drawer and the citation yellowed at the edges, people who saw the photograph would ask him what he had been thinking in that instant. He would usually answer with a joke to deflect the question. The truth was that his thoughts had not been on glory or fear, but on a line he had heard a German prisoner say in Sicily in a moment of bitter honesty. You Americans, the man had muttered, you are not better soldiers. You just act faster when the plan breaks. The third movement came much later still, when the war had ended and peace, or something like it, had settled over the ruined cities and fields. Carter went home to Pennsylvania. He married, found a job in a factory that converted to peacetime production, raised children who knew their father as a quiet man who kept old uniforms in a trunk and polished his boots on certain dates, without being asked why. The SCR 300 was replaced by jukeboxes and televisions. The language of grids and call signs faded into the background of civilian life. Yet, certain nights, when the wind rattled the windows just so, he would wake with the sensation that the ether itself was alive again, humming with overlapping voices. He would lie there, listening to an absence only he could hear, and think of farmers' fields, canal banks, muffled explosions in the distance, and a Dutch woman's hands tucking a blanket around his shoulders. Decades passed. Archivists in Britain and the United States declassified boxes of wartime signals traffic. Historians and enthusiasts combed through them, tracing obscure stories. Somewhere among the reams of paper, an analyst pieced together a chain. A strange burst of American-accented English on a Dutch civilian wavelength, a flurry of resistance transmissions from the same area, a sudden shift in artillery priorities, a change in German unit reports from confidence to alarm. One of those researchers eventually tracked down an old Dutchman living in a small house by a canal. He had once been a schoolteacher. Long before time bent his back and whitened his hair. When asked about the war years, he went to a cupboard and drew out a wireless set with a cracked wooden case. This, he said, patting it, spoke to an American that day. I told him if he transmitted again, the Germans would find him. He understood the risk. He did not transmit again. But he said enough the first time. Across the ocean, another researcher read that account and matched it to a faded citation in an airborne division archive. The name Sergeant Daniel Carter entered a footnote in a meticulous article about communications improvisation in airborne operations. By then, Carter himself was gone, buried under a stone that listed his rank, his units, and the wars he had served in. The Silver Star rested in a box on a shelf in his son's house. The story of a crazy call from a Dutch farmhouse had become part of a family legend, told at reunions and gradually woven into the broader tapestry of a conflict that seemed increasingly distant to those who had never heard a real artillery barrage. And yet, in ways both quiet and public, his choice lived on. In the doctrines of post-war armies, there was a small but significant shift. Rules about frequency usage and discipline remained strict, as they needed to be in any professional force, but alongside them, training began to emphasize something else: the responsibility of operators to adapt under exceptional circumstances. Case studies mentioned, in dry language, instances where use of non-standard communication channels under duress had saved larger formations from disaster. Officers learned to ask not only, did you follow the book, but also, did you understand why the book exists and when its assumptions no longer match the field? In civilian life, too, the principles had echoes. Emergency services, disaster relief agencies, and even amateur radio clubs explored how to build resilient communication networks that could survive when primary systems failed. The idea that, in a crisis, someone on the ground might have to break a peacetime regulation to get a life-saving message through became less shocking and more accepted. In that sense, the crazy call was not just a wartime anecdote, but part of a larger lesson about systems and people. Equipment mattered, procedures mattered, but at their core, radios were tools in human hands, and those hands sometimes had to choose between rigid obedience and thoughtful risk. If you stand today on the Dyke Road where that crossroads once lay, the scars of 1944 are not obvious. The fields are green in spring and golden in autumn. Bicycles rattle along the lanes. Children play in farmyards where once paratroopers dug shallow trenches. The farmhouse itself has been rebuilt, its walls straight and its roof sound, though an old photograph in the kitchen shows its shattered predecessor, tiles blown away, walls peppered with shrapnel, an American sergeant sitting on the step under a blanket. Tour groups sometimes come through, their guides pointing out where Allied units advanced and where German counterattacks stalled. Most of the visitors are more interested in the bigger, more famous names: Arnhem, Nijmegen, the Great Bridges. The Canal Line, the Crossroads, and the anonymous farmhouse do not feature heavily in glossy brochures, but if you talk long enough with the older residents, with those whose parents or grandparents hid radios under floorboards and food in false walls, you may hear a different emphasis. They will tell you that wars are not won only by famous generals or grand plans. They are decided in moments when unknown men and women look at broken lines on a map and choose to act differently from what is expected. A teacher risking his family to tap out a clandestine message, a pathfinder dropping into snow and darkness so that supply aircraft can find a besieged town, a signal sergeant in a drafty attic tuning his set beyond the edge of what is permitted. In those stories, the line, "How one radio operator's crazy call saved 2,000 paratroopers behind enemy lines," is not an exaggeration, but a shorthand. It stands for all the invisible threads of decision and chance that, woven together, pulled more than 2,000 men back from the edge of annihilation. When we look back at the vast machinery of the Second World War, armies that numbered in the millions, fleets that covered oceans, factories that turned out weapons by the shipload, it is tempting to see individuals as insignificant. Yet, each of those machines was made of people who, in certain moments, held in their hands the power to tilt outcomes disproportionately to their rank. Sergeant Daniel Carter was not a general. He was not a famous hero whose name appears in schoolbooks. He was a technician, trained to listen and to connect. On one cold morning in a Dutch farmhouse, he faced a choice that his manuals did not cover. Hold to the letter of peacetime regulation or take a calculated risk that might save men he could not see and would never meet. He chose the latter. 2,000 and more paratroopers walked away from that canal line because of a chain of actions in which his voice was one essential link. And in the end, that is what makes his story worth telling. Not as myth, not as inflated legend, but as a sober, fact-anchored testament to the way individual judgment under pressure can ripple outward into history. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.